Hi, I'm Rachel. The Sunday my mother walked into New Hope Megachurch wearing my childhood baptism dress, I knew she hadn't come to worship. She strutted down the center aisle in that sacred white lace, the dress I'd worn when I gave my heart to Jesus at 12 years old, now stretched tight across her frame like a costume. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The congregation turned to stare as she slid into the front pew, her red lipstick a slash of defiance against the holy fabric. But what happened next during my husband's sermon made her mockery look like child's play. What Marcus did from that pulpit didn't just break my heart, it broke something deeper. It shattered the last piece of my faith in the man I thought I married. The morning light filtered through our bedroom curtains, casting gentle shadows across the hardwood floor. Marcus was already gone, his side of the bed cold and perfectly made, hospital corners sharp enough to slice. Sunday mornings at our house had become a choreographed dance of preparation. Marcus would rise at 5, spend 2 hours in his study rehearsing his sermon, then head to church for staff prayer before I even stirred. I used to join him for those early morning prayers, but somewhere along the way he'd started saying the pastoral team needed focused spiritual preparation without distractions. I'd become a distraction. I slipped on my cream-colored dress, the one Marcus always said made me look appropriately pastoral, and fastened the modest pearl necklace his mother had given me on our wedding day. Everything about my appearance had to reflect well on New Hope Megachurch. Nothing flashy, nothing that might upstage the message or, more importantly, upstage Marcus. I'd learned that lesson early in our marriage when he'd quietly asked me to tone down my jewelry after a church elder mentioned that my earrings were quite sparkly during communion. The kitchen still smelled like yesterday's coffee, bitter and forgotten. I poured myself a glass of orange juice and stood at the window overlooking our perfectly manicured yard. Marcus insisted on professional landscaping, saying the pastor's home needed to represent the prosperity that faithful giving could bring to members' lives. Everything in our world had to serve the narrative of New Hope's success story. My phone buzzed against the marble countertop. A text from my mother, Dorothy Harper. "Looking forward to church today, sweetheart. I have a surprise for you." The message came with a winking emoji, which should have been my first warning. My mother didn't attend church. She'd made her feelings about my faith abundantly clear over the years, calling it a phase that got out of hand, and that religious nonsense that's keeping you from reaching your potential. The fact that she was coming to New Hope voluntarily sent a chill down my spine. I drove to church separately these days. Marcus needed to arrive early for his pastoral duties, and I'd grown to appreciate the quiet time in my car, listening to worship music and preparing my heart for service. The New Hope parking lot stretched for acres, filled with luxury cars and designer SUVs. Marcus often preached about how God wanted his people to be blessed, and the congregation seemed to take that message to heart. I parked in my usual spot near the children's ministry building, away from the main sanctuary where the cameras captured everything for the live stream. Inside the building, the energy was electric. Volunteers rushed around with headsets and clipboards, setting up for what Marcus called the show. He hated when I used that phrase, preferring worship experience or transformational gathering, but sometimes the production value felt more Broadway than Bethlehem. The stage was massive, with 3 giant screens, professional lighting rigs, and a 20-piece worship band. Everything was designed to create an emotional peak that would open hearts and wallets. I made my way to the green room behind the sanctuary, where Marcus was having his makeup touched up by a professional cosmetologist the church kept on staff. His sermon notes were spread across the table, covered in highlighting and scribbled additions. The title at the top made my stomach twist. Family First, Building God's Kingdom in Your Home. He looked up as I entered, his smile bright and practiced. "There's my beautiful wife," he said, loud enough for the makeup artist and 2 staff members to hear. "Ready to support your husband today?" It was the same question every Sunday, delivered with the same tone that expected only one answer. "Always?" I replied, because that's what a pastor's wife was supposed to say. What I didn't say was that I'd been supporting him for 6 years while slowly losing myself in the process. What I didn't mention was that building God's kingdom in our home had meant erasing Rachel Harper piece by piece until only Mrs. Marcus Webb remained. The sanctuary was filling rapidly as I took my seat in the front row, reserved for family and church leadership. New Hope's Sunday service drew over 3,000 people, with thousands more watching online. Marcus had built something impressive from humble beginnings, growing the church from a small congregation meeting in a rented community center to this sprawling campus with satellite locations across 3 counties. The success had changed him, or maybe it had simply revealed who he'd always been underneath the seminary training and pastoral facade. The worship team took the stage, and the lights dimmed dramatically. The opening song was one of Marcus's favorites, something about surrendering everything to God's plan. I sang along, my voice lost in the chorus of thousands, when I saw her. My mother, Dorothy Harper, walking down the center aisle like she owned the place. But it wasn't her presence that made my blood freeze. It was what she was wearing. My baptism dress. The white lace dress my grandmother had sewn by hand for my 12th birthday. The dress I'd worn when Pastor Williams had lowered me into the baptismal waters at Pine Creek Baptist Church. The dress that had been carefully preserved in my mother's cedar chest for over 15 years. She'd somehow found it, altered it to fit her larger frame, and was now parading it through New Hope Megachurch like a trophy. The fabric strained at the seams, the delicate lace stretched beyond its limits. She'd paired it with bright red heels and that slash of crimson lipstick, turning something sacred into something almost obscene. People stared as she walked, their whispers creating a buzz that competed with the worship music. She slid into the front pew, just 3 seats away from me, and turned to give me a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. "Surprise, sweetheart," she mouthed, smoothing the skirt of my baptism dress with manicured hands. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I kept my face composed. Years of being a pastor's wife had taught me to maintain the appearance of serenity even when my world was crumbling. I couldn't make a scene, couldn't create a distraction from the worship experience. Marcus would never forgive me if I let family drama interfere with church. So I smiled back at my mother, a tight, practiced smile that said nothing and everything. The worship set ended, and Marcus took the stage. He moved with the confidence of a man who commanded attention, his voice carrying across the sanctuary without effort. The opening of his sermon was smooth, polished, building toward what he called the heart of today's message. He talked about family being the cornerstone of faith, about how a man's relationship with his wife reflected his relationship with God. The congregation nodded and murmured agreement, hanging on every word. Then something shifted in his tone. His eyes found mine in the front row, then moved to my mother in her stolen dress. And his smile became something sharper. "You know, sometimes we have family members who don't understand our faith," Marcus said, his voice taking on a subtle edge. "Sometimes we have people in our lives who mock what we hold sacred, who think they can diminish the power of God by making a joke out of our beliefs." My mother's smile faltered slightly, but she kept her chin raised defiantly. Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger. "But let me tell you something about faith, church. Real faith isn't threatened by mockery. Real faith isn't shaken by people who don't understand the transformative power of Jesus Christ. And sometimes God uses the very people who try to tear us down to demonstrate His glory." The congregation was responding now, voices calling out "Amen" and "Preach it, Pastor!" But I felt sick. Marcus was using my mother's cruelty as sermon material, turning our family pain into a teaching moment for 3,000 people. He was exposing our private struggles for public consumption, all while making himself look like the faithful husband dealing with difficult in-laws. "My wife Rachel was baptized as a young girl," Marcus said, his hand gesturing toward me. "She wore a beautiful white dress that day, a symbol of her purity and commitment to Christ. That dress represented a sacred moment, a holy covenant between a child and her Savior." I wanted to sink through the floor. He was actually talking about the dress, about this moment, making it part of his sermon without my permission. The cameras were rolling, the live stream broadcasting to thousands more online. Our private family drama was becoming content for his ministry empire. But you see, when someone tries to mock that sacred moment, when they try to turn something holy into something profane, they're not just attacking the dress or the memory. They're attacking the faith itself. Marcus's voice rose, his preaching rhythm taking over. And that's when we have to stand up and declare that our God is bigger than their mockery, that our faith is stronger than their doubt. The sanctuary erupted in applause and shouts of agreement. My mother sat frozen, her defiant smile completely gone now, replaced by something that looked almost like fear. She'd come to embarrass me, to make a statement about what she saw as my misguided religious devotion. Instead, Marcus had turned her public mockery into his triumph, her cruelty into his content. But as I watched him bask in the congregation's approval, using our pain as fuel for his ministry machine, something cold settled in my chest. This wasn't righteous anger or justified defense of faith. This was Marcus seeing an opportunity and seizing it, turning even my mother's hatred into something that served his purposes. He'd taken my sacred memory, my childhood baptism, and weaponized it for his sermon without asking me, without caring how it would affect me to have that private moment dissected before thousands of strangers. Sometimes God allows people to reveal their true hearts, Marcus continued, his eyes boring into my mother's. Sometimes he lets the mockers mock, so that his people can see the difference between light and darkness, between faith and foolishness. My mother stood abruptly, her face flushed with embarrassment and anger. She pushed past the other people in the pew and walked out of the sanctuary, the white lace of my baptism dress flowing behind her like a damaged flag of surrender. The congregation watched her go, some with judgment, others with what looked like pity. Marcus never missed a beat, smoothly transitioning into the next point of his sermon as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. Something fundamental had shifted in that moment, not just in my relationship with my mother, but in my understanding of the man I'd married. Marcus had taken my pain and turned it into his platform. He'd exposed my family's dysfunction for the entertainment and edification of his audience. And he'd done it all while positioning himself as the righteous victim, the faithful husband dealing with ungodly in-laws. As he continued preaching about family and faith, I sat in that front pew with my hands folded and my smile fixed in place, but inside, I was rewriting everything
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
thought I knew about my marriage, my church, and the man who stood behind that pulpit claiming to speak for God. The sermon ended to thunderous applause and a standing ovation. Marcus had delivered another masterpiece, another moment that would be shared on social media and quoted in small group discussions throughout the week. As the congregation filed out, many of them stopped to squeeze my shoulder or whisper words of support about my difficult family situation. They meant well, but their sympathy only highlighted how thoroughly Marcus had made our private struggles into public theater. I waited until the sanctuary was nearly empty before making my way to the lobby. Marcus would be busy for at least another hour, shaking hands and accepting congratulations on his powerful message. I needed air, needed space to think about what had just happened and what it meant for everything I thought I understood about my life. Outside in the parking lot, I found my mother leaning against her silver Mercedes, the baptism dress wrinkled and somehow diminished in the harsh afternoon sunlight. Her makeup was smudged, her earlier confidence completely evaporated. When she saw me approaching, she straightened, but the fight had gone out of her. "Well," she said, her voice brittle, "I suppose I got what I deserved in there." I stopped a few feet away, studying this woman who had raised me, who had taught me to be strong and independent, who had also spent years trying to convince me that my faith was a weakness. "Why did you do it, Mom? Why did you wear my dress?" She looked down at the white lace, picking at a loose thread near the hem. "I thought if I could make you see how ridiculous it all looks from the outside, maybe you'd wake up. Maybe you'd remember that you used to have your own dreams before you became his shadow." Her words hit harder than I expected. "So you decided to humiliate me in front of 3,000 people? I thought I was saving you," she said quietly. "From him, from all of this." She gestured toward the massive church building, its modern architecture gleaming in the sun. "You used to want to be a teacher, Rachel. You had plans, goals that had nothing to do with standing behind some man while he preached about things he doesn't even believe." "You don't know, Marcus," I said automatically, but the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. My mother laughed, but there was no humor in it. Don't I? I saw him in there, sweetheart. The way he used what I did turned it into entertainment for his audience. A real man of God would have handled that privately with love and grace. Your husband saw an opportunity to look good in front of his congregation and he took it. I wanted to argue with her, to defend Marcus and our marriage and the ministry we'd built together, but standing there in that parking lot, I couldn't find the words. Because somewhere deep down, I knew she was right about at least part of it. Marcus had turned our family crisis into sermon material without consulting me, without caring how it would affect me to have my childhood memories dissected for public consumption. The dress was mine to wear, my mother continued. You left it in my house, in my cedar chest. I figured if it represented your faith so much, I'd show everyone what that faith has cost you. You've disappeared, Rachel. The daughter I raised, the girl with fire in her eyes and dreams bigger than this town, she's gone. I'm still here, I said, but my voice lacked conviction. Are you? She pulled her car keys from her purse, a designer bag that probably cost more than most of Marcus's congregation made in a month. Because the Rachel I know wouldn't have sat there silent while her husband made her childhood baptism into a sermon illustration without her permission. She got into her car and drove away, leaving me standing in that parking lot in my cream-colored dress and modest pearls, wondering if anything about my life was actually mine anymore. The baptism dress was gone, but the memory of my mother wearing it, of Marcus using it, would stay with me. And for the first time in 6 years of marriage, I started to wonder what else I'd lost along the way. That night, Marcus was euphoric. The sermon had been shared hundreds of times on social media already. Church members were calling and texting about how powerfully God had moved through him. He paced around our living room, still energized from the day's success, recounting moments from the service like a performer reviewing his greatest hits. Did you see the response when I talked about sacred moments? He asked, his eyes bright with excitement. The whole congregation was with me. Even the cameras caught that perfect shot when your mother walked out. It's going to make an incredible highlight reel for next week's promotional video. I sat on our gray sectional sofa, still wearing the cream dress that made me look appropriately pastoral, and watched this man I'd married celebrate turning our family pain into content for his ministry brand. He was already planning how to use the footage, how to craft the story for maximum impact in future sermons and social media posts. Marcus, I said quietly, you used my baptism without asking me. He stopped pacing and looked at me with surprise. What do you mean? You talked about my baptism dress, my childhood memory, in front of 3,000 people. You made it part of your sermon without asking how I felt about it. His expression shifted from surprise to something that looked almost like annoyance. Rachel, your mother was making a mockery of our faith in front of the entire congregation. I had to address it. I couldn't just let her disrespect God's house like that, but you could have handled it differently. You could have spoken to her privately, or addressed the situation without bringing up my personal memories. Marcus sat down across from me, his voice taking on the patient tone he used when explaining things to children or new converts. Sweetheart, sometimes God puts us in situations where we have to choose between our comfort and His glory. Your baptism story was exactly what the congregation needed to hear in that moment. It was a perfect illustration of faith triumphing over mockery. It was my story, I said. My memory. And you used it without asking me. He reached for my hands, his touch gentle but somehow condescending. Rachel, we're partners in this ministry. Your story is part of our story. When God gave me that sermon, He was using both of our experiences to touch lives. Don't you want to be part of something bigger than yourself? The question hung in the air between us, loaded with implications. This was how it always went when I questioned anything about the church or His leadership. He'd reframe my concerns as selfishness, my discomfort as lack of faith. He'd make me feel small for wanting agency over my own experiences, guilty for not wanting to sacrifice everything for the greater good of His ministry. I just wish you'd asked, I said finally. Marcus squeezed my hands and smiled. Next time I'll try to remember. But honestly, Rachel, the way you supported me today, the grace you showed in that difficult situation, it was beautiful. The congregation saw Christ in you. He kissed my forehead and headed to his study to prepare for the evening service, leaving me alone on the couch, wondering when supporting him had become synonymous with erasing myself. I thought about my mother's words, about the girl with fire in her eyes and dreams bigger than this town. I tried to remember the last time I'd made a decision about my own life, the last time I'd wanted something that wasn't directly related to Marcus's ministry or New Hope's success. The house felt very quiet suddenly, filled with expensive furniture and carefully chosen decor that reflected the image of prosperity that Marcus wanted to project. Everything was beautiful, tasteful, appropriate for a pastor's home. Nothing was mine, not really. Even the family photos on the mantel were professionally taken shots of us at church events, Marcus's arm around my waist as we smiled for his publicity materials. I walked to the window and looked out at our perfect yard, our perfect neighborhood, our perfect life that felt like it was slowly suffocating me. Tomorrow would bring new expectations, new ways I'd need to support the ministry, new opportunities for me to disappear a little more behind the role of pastor's wife. But tonight, for just a moment, I let myself remember what it felt like to want something that was entirely my own. My phone buzzed with a text from Chloe Martinez, my best friend from before I'd married Marcus. Saw the live stream. You okay? Just 3 words, but they carried more genuine concern than all the congratulations Marcus had received about his powerful sermon. I stared at the message for a long time before typing back, "Can we talk tomorrow?" Maybe it was time to start remembering who I used to be before I became Mrs. Marcus Webb. Maybe it was time to find that girl with fire in her eyes, even if it meant risking everything I thought I wanted. Because standing in that perfect house, wearing that appropriate dress, I realized that my mother had been right about one thing. I had disappeared. The question was whether it was too late to find myself again. The coffee shop downtown felt like stepping into another world after the sterile perfection of New Hope's campus. Chloe had chosen a corner table away from the windows, where we could talk without being seen by any church members who might happen to drive by. She was already waiting when I arrived, her dark hair pulled back in a messy bun, wearing jeans and a paint-stained sweater that reminded me of the art classes we used to take together before my life became consumed by pastoral duties. "You look tired," she said as I slid into the chair across from her, not bothering with pleasantries. I'd barely slept after yesterday's sermon, replaying the moment over and over when Marcus had turned my baptism into his teaching illustration. "It's been a difficult few days." Chloe studied my face with the intensity of someone who'd known me since college, who remembered who I was before I became half of a pastoral power couple. "I watched the live stream yesterday. That was your mom in the white dress, wasn't it?" "My baptism dress," I confirmed, my voice barely above a whisper. She found it in her cedar chest and decided to make a statement. And Marcus turned it into sermon material. It wasn't a question. Chloe had always been able to read situations with uncomfortable accuracy. I wrapped my hands around my coffee cup, seeking warmth I couldn't seem to find anywhere else. He said God gave him that message in the moment, that it was exactly what the congregation needed to hear. "What did you need, Rachel?" The question caught me off guard. When was the last time someone had asked what I needed instead of what the church needed, what Marcus needed, what the ministry required? "I don't know," I admitted. "I honestly don't know anymore." Chloe leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "Do you remember when we were seniors, and you were going to apply for that teaching fellowship in Colorado? You were so excited about working with underprivileged kids, about making a real difference in their lives. The memory felt like looking at someone else's life through foggy glass. That was a long time ago. You gave it up when you started dating Marcus. Said God was calling you to support his ministry instead." Chloe's expression was carefully neutral, but I could hear the unspoken question in her tone. "Marriage requires sacrifice," I said automatically, repeating words I'd heard Marcus use in countless premarital counseling sessions with engaged couples. "Does it require disappearing?" Chloe asked. "Because that's what's happened, Rachel. You've become an accessory to his success story." Her words stung because they echoed what my mother had said in the parking lot, what I'd been trying not to acknowledge for months. "You don't understand the pressure of ministry life. Everything we do reflects on the church." "Everything you do reflects on him, you mean?" Chloe pulled out her phone and showed me the New Hope website. There, on the leadership page, was Marcus's professional headshot, his biography listing his seminary degrees and ministry accomplishments. Next to it was a smaller photo of me, smiling in that cream-colored dress, with exactly 3 lines of text. Rachel Webb supports her husband's ministry through women's outreach and pastoral care. She enjoys reading and spending time with church families. I stared at the screen, realizing I couldn't remember the last time I'd been asked what I enjoyed. The biography might as well have said, "Pastor's wife exists to make pastor look good." "When did you stop having your own dreams?" Chloe asked softly. The question hit like a physical blow. I tried to remember the last time I'd wanted something that wasn't connected to Marcus's vision for our life, the church's needs, or my role as the perfect pastoral spouse. The silence stretched between us as I failed to find an answer. "I should go," I said finally, standing to leave. "Marcus will be wondering where I am." Chloe didn't try to stop me, but her voice followed me to the door. "I'm here when you're ready to remember who you used to be." The drive home felt longer than usual, Chloe's words echoing in my head alongside my mother's accusations from the day before. At a red light, I caught sight of myself in the rearview mirror. When had I started looking so careful, so controlled? When had my smile become something I performed rather than felt? Our neighborhood was quiet in the afternoon sun, all manicured lawns and expensive cars that spoke of the prosperity gospel Marcus preached so effectively. I pulled into our driveway next to Marcus's black BMW, a gift from the church board when we'd reached the 5,000-member milestone. Everything in our life came with strings attached to New Hope's success. Inside, I could hear Marcus on a conference call in his study, his voice carrying the authoritative tone he used when discussing church business. The reaction to Sunday's message was incredible. Social media engagement is up 40% from last week. "I think we should definitely consider a sermon series on faith in the face of family opposition." I froze in the hallway outside his door. He was already planning to build on Sunday's incident, to turn my family's dysfunction into a multi-week teaching series. My baptism dress moment wasn't just sermon illustration anymore. It was becoming a ministry brand. "We could bring in some guest speakers," Marcus continued. "People who've overcome family rejection because of their faith. Maybe get some testimonies from the congregation about dealing with unsupportive relatives." I slipped past his door and headed upstairs to our bedroom, needing space to think. The room was decorated in neutral tones that Marcus's interior designer had chosen, nothing too personal or distinctive. On my nightstand was a devotional book with my bookmark exactly where it had been for 3 weeks, back when I'd still been trying to maintain the spiritual disciplines expected of a pastor's wife. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Rachel, this is your mother. I'm sorry about yesterday. Can we talk?" I stared at the message for a long time before typing back a simple yes. We arranged to meet at a small diner outside town, the kind of place where church members wouldn't think to look for the pastor's wife. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was sneaking around to have a conversation with my own mother, but everything in my life had become about managing Marcus's image and the church's reputation. That evening, Marcus was in exceptional spirits during dinner. The church's social media metrics were trending upward. Several members had called to thank him for his brave stand against family opposition to faith, and he'd already received 3 speaking invitations from other churches wanting to hear his testimony about dealing with difficult in-laws. "God is really using this situation," he said between bites of the salmon I'd prepared according to his dietary preferences. "Sometimes he allows trials in our personal lives to become testimonies that can impact thousands of people." "What if I don't want my personal life to be a testimony?" The words came out before I could stop them. Marcus looked up from his plate, genuinely surprised. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if I want some things to stay private? What if I don't want my childhood memories or family problems turned into sermon illustrations?" His expression shifted to the patient concern he used with congregation members who were struggling with spiritual immaturity. "Rachel, honey, that's a very natural response. It's hard when God asks us to be vulnerable for the sake of others. But think about all the lives that were touched by your story on Sunday." "It wasn't my story," I said. "You told it. You framed it. You decided what it meant and how to use it." Marcus set down his fork and reached across the table for my hand. We're partners in this ministry. Your experiences are part of our shared calling to serve God's people. Don't you want to be part of something bigger than yourself? There it was again, that phrase he used whenever I expressed any desire for autonomy or privacy. Wanting control over my own story was selfish. Desiring boundaries was spiritual immaturity. Everything had to be sacrificed on the altar of the greater good, which always seemed to align perfectly with Marcus's career advancement. What if the greater good isn't always the same as your sermon series? I asked. The question hung in the air like smoke from a candle that had just been blown out. Marcus's smile became tighter, more practiced. I think you might be letting your mother's visit affect your perspective more than you realize. Maybe we should schedule some time with Dr. Patterson for counseling. Dr. Patterson was the church's counseling pastor, a man who'd never met a marital problem that couldn't be solved by the wife submitting more completely to her husband's leadership. The suggestion wasn't about healing our relationship. It was about correcting my attitude. I don't need counseling, I said. I need you to ask me before you use my life as sermon material. Marcus's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. Rachel, I'm concerned about this spirit of rebellion I'm seeing. It's not like you to question the ministry or my leadership in our home. Spirit of rebellion. The phrase sent a chill through me. In Marcus's world, any woman who questioned male authority was rebellious. Any wife who wanted input into decisions affecting her own life was stepping outside God's design for marriage. I'd heard him counsel other women with similar language, always with the underlying message that their desires were inherently suspect. Maybe I should have been questioning things sooner, I said quietly. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Marcus studied me with eyes that had gone completely cold, calculating. I think you need some time to pray about your attitude. Maybe step back from some of your ministry responsibilities until you can approach them with the right heart. It was a threat, carefully couched in spiritual language. Step back into line or be removed from the ministry roles that gave my life any sense of purpose. Marcus had used similar tactics with other women who'd challenged his authority, always making it seem like their choice to withdraw from leadership when really they'd been systematically isolated and diminished. I stood up from the table, my appetite completely gone. I'm going to bed. Rachel. His voice stopped me at the kitchen doorway. I love you, but I love God more. And I won't let anyone, including my wife, interfere with what he's called me to do. The words followed me upstairs like a pronouncement of judgment. I got ready for bed in mechanical movements, brushing my teeth and washing my face while trying to process what had just happened. Marcus had made it clear that questioning his decisions was equivalent to opposing God's will. My autonomy was rebellion. My desires were obstacles to overcome. Lying in bed that night, I stared at the ceiling, while Marcus slept peacefully beside me, already planning tomorrow's devotional time and the next sermon in his Faith in the Face of Family Opposition series. But I was done being material for his ministry empire. I was done disappearing piece by piece into the role he'd created for me. For the first time in 6 years, I started planning something that was entirely my own. The next morning brought the familiar ritual of Marcus's early departure for church. I waited until his car disappeared down our street before opening my laptop and doing something I hadn't done in years. I started researching my options. Not our options, not what would be best for the church or Marcus's career, but what might be possible for Rachel Harper if she still existed somewhere underneath Mrs. Marcus Webb. The teaching fellowship Chloe had mentioned was long gone, but similar programs still existed. There were opportunities for people with my educational background, possibilities I'd never considered because they would require Marcus to be supportive of my career instead of the other way around. I spent 3 hours exploring websites and reading application requirements, feeling something I'd almost forgotten, excitement about my own future. My phone rang just before noon. Marcus's name appeared on the screen, but I let it go to voicemail. Then it rang again. And again. Finally I answered. Where are you? His voice carried an edge of irritation. I've been calling for 20 minutes. I'm at home. I didn't hear my phone. I need you to come to the church. The ladies' ministry coordinator called in sick. And we have that new member orientation this afternoon. You'll need to handle the women's breakout session. It wasn't a request. It was an expectation that I would drop everything to fill whatever gap appeared in his perfectly orchestrated church machine. Marcus, I'm in the middle of something important. More important than serving God's people? The question was loaded with implication. In his world, nothing I could be doing at home was more important than supporting his ministry. Yes, I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. Actually, it is. The silence on the other end stretched for several heartbeats. Rachel, I don't know what's gotten into you lately, but this attitude needs to stop. I need my wife to be supportive, not creating problems. I'm not creating problems by having my own priorities. Your priorities should align with our ministry calling, Marcus said, his tone taking on the authoritative edge he used from the pulpit. We'll discuss this when I get home tonight. He hung up before I could respond, leaving me holding the phone and realizing that somewhere in the last 6 years my husband had started talking to me like an employee rather than a partner. Everything was about what he needed, what the church required, what would serve his vision for our shared life. When had I stopped being a person and become a supporting character in the Marcus Webb story? I closed the laptop and drove to meet my mother at the diner we'd agreed on, a small place called Maggie's that served comfort food to truckers and local farmers. Dorothy was already there, sitting in a corner booth away from the windows, still beautiful but somehow diminished since Sunday's confrontation. She'd traded her designer clothes for simple slacks and a sweater, looking more like the woman who'd raised me than the society matron she'd become. Thank you for coming, she said as I slid into the seat across from her. I wasn't sure you would. I wasn't sure either. I ordered coffee from a waitress who'd clearly never heard of New Hope Megachurch or Pastor Marcus Webb. The anonymity felt like a luxury. I owe you an apology, my mother said once we were alone. What I did on Sunday was cruel. I was angry, but that doesn't excuse it. Why were you angry? I asked. Really? Not just about the dress or the church, but why were you so angry that you'd planned something like that? Dorothy stirred her coffee slowly, organizing her thoughts. Because I watched my brilliant, passionate daughter disappear into someone else's dream. Because the girl who used to argue politics at the dinner table and planned to change the world now spends her time arranging flowers for someone else's sermons. Her words stung because they were true. Marriage requires compromise. Compromise? Yes. Complete erasure? No. She looked up from her coffee cup, her eyes fierce with maternal concern. When was the last time you made a decision about your own life, Rachel? When did you last want something that wasn't connected to his church or his career? I opened my mouth to argue, but the words wouldn't come. Because she was right. Everything in my life revolved around Marcus's vision, his calling, his needs. I'd become an accessory to his success, valuable only in how well I supported his ministry brand. I was trying to wake you up on Sunday. My mother continued. I thought if I could show you how ridiculous it all looked from the outside, maybe you'd remember who you used to be. By humiliating me in front of 3,000 people? By showing you that your faith isn't dependent on his interpretation of it. That baptism dress was yours, Rachel. You earned that moment, that memory, that relationship with God. He had no right to turn it into sermon material, and you had every right to refuse. The conversation continued for over an hour, my mother sharing perspectives I'd been too proud or too programmed to hear before. She talked about watching me shrink into the role of pastor's wife, about seeing my dreams replaced by his ambitions, about the way Marcus controlled our conversations even when he wasn't present. I raised you to be a leader, not a follower, she said as we prepared to leave. I taught you to question authority, to think for yourself, to never let anyone speak for you. That girl is still in there somewhere. Driving home, I thought about the laptop sitting on my kitchen table, about the applications I'd been reading, about the life I might have had if I'd chosen differently 6 years ago. But more than that, I thought about the choice I could still make. It wasn't too late to remember who Rachel Harper had been before she became Mrs. Marcus Webb. Marcus was waiting when I got home, sitting in the living room with his sermon notes spread across the coffee table. His expression was carefully controlled, the look he wore when addressing a difficult counseling situation or a challenging board meeting. "We need to talk," he said, without looking up from his papers. "Yes, we do." I sat down across from him, not beside him on the couch where he could control the physical dynamic of our conversation. "I've been thinking about your behavior lately," Marcus began, his voice taking on the tone he used for serious pastoral conversations. "The questioning, the resistance to ministry responsibilities, the attitude you displayed yesterday. I think you might be experiencing a spiritual crisis." "A spiritual crisis?" I repeated. "Or maybe I'm experiencing clarity for the first time in years." His eyes sharpened. "Clarity about what?" "About the fact that I don't exist in this marriage except as an extension of your ministry. About how I've let you turn me into a supporting character in your success story." Marcus set down his papers and leaned forward, switching to the gentle, condescending tone he used with congregants who were struggling with doubt. "Rachel, honey, I understand that being a pastor's wife comes with unique challenges. But God has called us to this life together. Your role in supporting the ministry is vital, even if it doesn't always feel fulfilling in worldly terms." "My role," I said slowly. "What exactly is my role, Marcus? Because according to your website, I exist to support you and enjoy reading." "You're being dramatic." "Am I? When was the last time you asked what I wanted? When did you last consider my dreams, my goals, my calling that might be separate from yours?" Marcus's patience was clearly wearing thin. "Your calling is to be my helpmate, to support the vision God has given me for this church and our ministry. That's what biblical marriage looks like. According to you. According to Scripture." His voice was rising now, taking on the authoritative edge that brooked no disagreement. "I am the head of this household, Rachel. God has placed me in authority over you, and when you resist that authority, you're not just rebelling against me, you're rebelling against God's design." There it was, the theological trump card he used whenever his leadership was questioned. Any disagreement with Marcus was tantamount to disagreeing with God himself. Any desire for autonomy was rebellion against divine order. It was a closed system that made him infallible and me perpetually wrong. "What if God's design for my life is bigger than being your supporting cast?" I asked. Marcus stood up abruptly, his face flushed with anger he was trying to contain. "I think you need to spend some serious time in prayer and Bible study. Maybe take a break from your ministry responsibilities until you can approach them with a submissive heart." There's that word again. Submissive. It's a biblical concept, Rachel. One that modern women struggle with because of cultural programming, but it's God's design for marriage nonetheless. I stood up too, meeting his gaze directly. "Maybe I struggle with it because it's been used to erase everything about me that doesn't serve your purposes." The air between us crackled with tension, 6 years of unspoken resentments finally surfacing. Marcus stared at me as if seeing a stranger, someone who'd somehow invaded his carefully controlled world and disrupted the order he'd worked so hard to establish. "I don't know who you've been talking to," he said finally, "but this isn't you, Rachel. This rebellion, this selfishness, it's not the woman I married." "You're right," I said quietly. "The woman you married doesn't exist anymore. You've spent 6 years systematically erasing her, and I've let you do it." Marcus's expression shifted from anger to something that looked almost like fear. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I'm done disappearing. I'm done being an accessory to your success. I'm done letting you speak for me, decide for me, and use my life as material for your sermons." The silence that followed felt like the moment between lightning and thunder, pregnant with the promise of the storm to come. Marcus gathered his sermon notes with careful precision, his movements controlled but his hands slightly shaking. "I'll be in my study," he said without looking at me. "When you're ready to apologize and discuss this like a mature Christian woman, let me know." He left me standing in our perfect living room, surrounded by all the trappings of ministerial success, and for the first time in years I felt completely alone. But it wasn't the loneliness of abandonment. It was the solitude of finally being honest with myself about what my life had become and what I wanted it to be instead. That night, I opened my laptop again and started filling out the first application I'd looked at earlier. It was for a literacy program coordinator position with a nonprofit that served underprivileged communities 3 states away. The job required someone with my educational background and offered the kind of meaningful work I'd dreamed of doing before I'd become convinced that my highest calling was supporting someone else's dreams. As I typed my responses to the application questions, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: hope for a future that belonged entirely to me. It might mean leaving everything I'd built with Marcus, walking away from the security and status of being a pastor's wife, starting over in a place where no one knew Mrs. Marcus Webb. But maybe that's exactly what I needed. Maybe it was time to find out who Rachel Harper could become when she was free to make her own choices, chase her own dreams, and speak with her own voice. The application took me 3 hours to complete, and when I finally hit submit at nearly midnight, my hands were trembling. Not with fear, but with the exhilaration of taking the first step toward reclaiming my own life. Upstairs, Marcus was already asleep, probably dreaming about his next sermon series and the continued growth of New Hope Megachurch. But I lay awake staring at the ceiling, imagining a different kind of future, one where my worth wasn't measured by how well I supported someone else's vision, where my voice mattered as much as my silence, where Rachel Harper was more than just a footnote in the Marcus Webb story. For the first time in 6 years, I fell asleep excited about tomorrow. The response came faster than I expected. 3 days after submitting my application, an email appeared in my personal account with the subject line, "Interview Request, Literacy Program Coordinator Position." My heart raced as I read the message from Sarah Chen, the program director, asking if I could participate in a video interview the following week. They'd been impressed with my background and wanted to discuss the position further. I stared at the screen for a long time, realizing this was the first time in years that someone had been interested in my qualifications rather than my relationship to Marcus. They wanted to interview Rachel Harper, not Pastor Webb's wife. The distinction felt revolutionary. Marcus had left early for a denominational conference in Nashville, giving me the freedom to schedule the interview without having to explain my activities. I replied to Sarah's email, confirming a time when I knew I'd be alone in the house. The secrecy felt both necessary and shameful. What kind of marriage required hiding career opportunities from your spouse? That afternoon, I drove to the church to fulfill my obligations for the weekly women's Bible study. The topic was finding your purpose in God's plan, which felt like divine irony given my current circumstances. As I sat in the circle of women discussing how God's plan for their lives aligned with supporting their husbands and raising godly children, I found myself questioning everything I'd been taught about biblical womanhood. Linda Patterson, the pastor's wife from our sister church, led the discussion with her usual blend of scripture and personal testimony. Ladies, we have to remember that our highest calling as Christian women is to be helpmates to our husbands. When we chase our own dreams instead of supporting theirs, we're stepping outside of God's design. Several women nodded in agreement, sharing stories about how they'd given up career aspirations to follow their husbands' callings. The narrative was always the same. Sacrifice presented as spiritual maturity, self-erasure framed as obedience to God. I'd told similar stories myself over the years, turning my abandoned teaching dreams into testimony about finding fulfillment in ministry support. "Rachel," Linda said, turning her attention to me, "you're such a beautiful example of this principle. The way you've supported Pastor Marcus's calling has been instrumental in New Hope's growth. Would you share with the group about finding joy in your helpmate role?" 20 pairs of eyes turned toward me expectantly. These women saw me as the model pastor's wife, the gold standard of biblical submission and ministry support. They wanted me to validate their own sacrifices by sharing how fulfilled I was in my supporting role. "I think," I said slowly, "that sometimes we need to be careful about assuming God's plan for our lives looks exactly like someone else's interpretation of Scripture." The room went quiet. Linda's smile became slightly strained. "What do you mean by that?" "I mean that maybe God gave us gifts and passions for reasons beyond just supporting other people's dreams. Maybe He wants us to use our talents directly, not just indirectly through our husbands' ministries." The discomfort in the room was palpable. These women had built their identities around the very narrative I was questioning. To suggest that their sacrifices might not be divinely mandated was to threaten the foundation of how they understood their lives and choices. Well, Linda said carefully, I think we need to be very careful about letting cultural feminism influence our understanding of biblical truth. The enemy often uses our desires for independence to lead us away from God's design. There it was again, the suggestion that any woman who wanted agency over her own life was being influenced by evil. Any desire for self-determination was automatically suspect, labeled as rebellion against divine order. I'd use similar language myself when counseling young women in the church, always steering them away from career ambitions that might compete with future husbands' callings. The study continued, but I participated minimally, my mind occupied with the interview requests sitting in my email inbox. When the session ended, several women approached me with concerned expressions, clearly troubled by my earlier comments. "Are you okay, Rachel?" asked Janet Morrison, one of the church's founding members. "You seemed a little off today." "I'm fine," I replied automatically. "Just thinking through some things." "Sometimes when we're struggling spiritually, it helps to talk to our husbands," suggested another woman. "Pastor Marcus has such wisdom. I'm sure he could help you work through whatever you're wrestling with." The assumption that my spiritual struggles needed to be filtered through Marcus's interpretation struck me as profoundly wrong. When had I stopped believing I could hear from God directly? When had my relationship with the divine become dependent on my husband's mediation? Driving home from the church, I passed the cemetery where my grandmother was buried. On impulse, I pulled into the parking area and walked to her gravesite. Helen Harper had been a woman of deep faith and fierce independence, qualities that had sometimes put her at odds with the more traditional expectations of her era. She'd raised 5 children while running a successful catering business, never seeing any contradiction between her faith and her professional ambitions. Standing beside her headstone, I remembered conversations we'd had during my college years about following God's calling wherever it led. She'd never suggested that my gender limited my opportunities or that my highest aspiration should be supporting someone else's dreams. "God gave you a brain, sweetheart," she used to say. "I expect He wants you to use it." My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Conference going well. Dr. Peterson wants to discuss having me speak at their summer leadership retreat. This could be a big opportunity for expanding our influence." I read the message twice, noting how naturally he framed everything in terms of our ministry even when discussing his individual opportunities. The possessive pronoun had become automatic, a linguistic reminder that I existed primarily as an extension of his success, rather than as a person with my own calling and gifts. That evening, I prepared for the video interview with more care than I'd taken with my appearance in months. I chose a navy blazer that had been hanging unworn in my closet, clothing I'd purchased back when I still attended professional development workshops and networking events. Looking in the mirror, I caught a glimpse of someone I'd almost forgotten, a woman who looked capable and confident rather than merely appropriate for her husband's image. The interview was scheduled for 10 in the morning, when Marcus would be in his second session at the conference. I set up my laptop in the guest bedroom, away from any religious imagery or church-related materials that might influence the conversation. For 45 minutes, I wanted to be evaluated solely on my own merits and qualifications. Sarah Chen appeared on screen exactly on time, a woman in her early 40s with graying hair and intelligent eyes. Behind her, I could see a wall covered with children's artwork and photos from literacy events. The atmosphere was warm and purposeful, focused on the mission rather than maintaining appearances. "Thank you for making time for this conversation, Rachel," Sarah began. "I was impressed with your application, particularly your educational background and your passion for working with underserved communities. Can you tell me what draws you to literacy work specifically?" For the first time in years, someone was asking about my interests, my motivations, my vision for meaningful work. I found myself speaking with an enthusiasm I'd almost forgotten I possessed, discussing the connection between literacy and empowerment, the way reading skills could transform entire communities, the potential for education to break cycles of poverty and disadvantage. "Your experience with curriculum development is particularly relevant," Sarah noted, referring to work I'd done before marriage that had been relegated to a footnote on church bio pages. We're looking for someone who can not only coordinate existing programs, but also develop new approaches for different learning styles and cultural backgrounds. The conversation flowed naturally, touching on program logistics, funding challenges, and the collaborative approach the organization took to community development. Sarah described a work environment where ideas were valued regardless of their source, where team members were encouraged to innovate and take initiative, where success was measured by impact rather than compliance. The position would require relocation to our headquarters in Austin, Sarah explained near the end of our conversation. We provide a comprehensive benefits package and support for professional development. Are you in a position to consider that kind of change? The question hung in the air, loaded with implications that went far beyond geographical logistics. Was I in a position to leave everything I'd built with Marcus? Could I walk away from the security and status of being a pastor's wife? Was I prepared to start over in a place where no one knew Mrs. Marcus Webb? I would be very interested in discussing the details, I heard myself saying. The mission aligns perfectly with work I've always wanted to do. After the interview ended, I sat in the guest bedroom, staring at the blank computer screen, processing what had just happened. For 45 minutes, I'd been Rachel Harper again, not the pastor's wife, not the ministry helpmate, not the woman whose primary value lay in how well she supported someone else's calling. I'd been myself, discussing my own ideas and aspirations with someone who took them seriously. The feeling was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. Marcus's name appeared on the screen, and I felt an immediate spike of anxiety, as if he could somehow sense what I'd been doing from 200 miles away. "How's your day going?" he asked, his voice carrying the energy of successful networking and ministry advancement. "Fine. Quiet. How's the conference?" "Incredible. The connections I'm making here could really expand our reach." Dr. Peterson was telling me about churches that have grown from our size to over 20,000 members by implementing the right growth strategies. I listened as he described sessions on church marketing, leadership development, and financial stewardship, noting how every conversation seemed to revolve around expansion and influence. When had ministry become indistinguishable from business development? When had success become measured in numbers rather than lives genuinely transformed? "Oh, and I have exciting news," Marcus continued. "They want me to contribute to a book about innovative ministry approaches. It could really establish me as a thought leader in our denomination." "That's wonderful," I said, meaning it. Marcus was genuinely gifted at building organizations and inspiring people. But somewhere along the way, his gifts had become about building his own kingdom rather than serving something larger than himself. "I should be home by dinner tomorrow," he said. "We can celebrate and start planning how to leverage this momentum." After he hung up, I walked downstairs to our kitchen and made myself a cup of tea, processing the contrast between his excitement about expanding his influence and my own growing desire to find work that felt meaningful rather than merely successful. We were moving in opposite directions, and I wasn't sure there was any way to reconcile the divergence. That afternoon, I drove to visit Aunt Louise, my grandmother's younger sister, who lived in an assisted living facility about 30 minutes from our house. At 87, she remained sharp and opinionated, one of the few people in my life who remembered who I'd been before I became half of a pastoral couple. Louise was waiting in the lobby when I arrived, dressed in a bright purple sweater that would have horrified the New Hope dress code committee. She'd never been one to fade quietly into acceptable femininity, even in her advanced years. "You look tired, honey," she said as we settled into chairs in the facility's sunroom. "And thin. Are you eating enough?" "I'm fine, Aunt Louise. Just busy with church responsibilities." She studied me with eyes that had witnessed 8 decades of human behavior and weren't easily fooled. "Church responsibilities? Or husband responsibilities? Because there's a difference, you know." Her directness was both refreshing and unsettling after years of conversations carefully managed to avoid any topic that might reflect poorly on pastoral leadership. "Both, I suppose." "Your grandmother used to worry about you," Louise said without preamble. "She thought you were too willing to sacrifice yourself for other people's comfort." The observation hit like a physical blow. "Grandma never said anything to me about that. She didn't want to interfere in your marriage. But she noticed things. The way you stopped talking about your own dreams. how you started speaking in we when discussing your future, how you began dressing to please someone else instead of expressing yourself. I sat quietly, absorbing the idea that my grandmother had seen the gradual erosion of my identity, even when I'd been too immersed in the process to recognize it myself. Helen raised you to be a leader, not a follower, Louise continued. She taught you to think critically, to question authority, to never let anyone speak for you. But somewhere along the way, you forgot those lessons. Marriage requires compromise, I said, repeating the phrase that had become my default response to criticism of my supporting role. Compromise, yes. Complete surrender, no. Louise leaned forward, her voice taking on the firmness she'd used when I was a child testing boundaries. Tell me, Rachel, when was the last time you made a decision about your own life without considering how it would affect his image or his career? The question echoed similar challenges from Chloe and my mother, but coming from Louise, who'd known me since birth, it carried additional weight. She wasn't speaking from outside observation, but from decades of watching me grow and change. I don't know, I admitted. Everything in our life affects the church somehow. Everything in your life affects his church, Louise corrected. When did your calling become secondary to his calling? When did your relationship with God start being filtered through his interpretation? I wanted to argue, to defend the biblical principles of marriage and submission that had guided my choices for 6 years. But sitting in that sunroom, surrounded by residents who'd lived full lives and made their own mistakes, I couldn't find the theological arguments that had once seemed so convincing. I got an interview offer today, I said suddenly, surprising myself with the admission. For a job that would require moving to Austin. Louise's eyes brightened with interest rather than concern. What kind of job? I told her about the literacy program, about Sarah Chen's genuine interest in my qualifications, about the opportunity to do work that felt meaningful and directly impactful. Louise listened without interrupting, her expression growing more animated as I described the position and its responsibilities. That sounds perfect for you, she said when I finished. You always loved working with kids, and you have the educational background to make a real difference. It would mean leaving everything here, the church, our life, our community. It would mean choosing your own path instead of walking in someone else's footsteps, Louise replied. There's a difference. We sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching other residents tend to a small garden visible through the sunroom windows. These were people who'd survived wars, raised families, built careers, weathered losses, and emerged with the wisdom that comes from living authentically rather than carefully. Your grandmother left you something, Louise said eventually, reaching into her purse and pulling out a small jewelry box. I was supposed to give it to you when you needed it most. I think that time might be now. Inside the box was a simple gold bracelet with a small charm engraved with words I recognized from one of my grandmother's favorite Bible verses. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, to give you hope and a future. She wanted you to remember that God's plans for your life might be bigger than other people's plans for your life, Louise explained. Even when those other people are good people with good intentions. I fastened the bracelet around my wrist, feeling the weight of the charm against my skin. For the first time in months, I felt connected to something larger than the carefully constructed world of New Hope Megachurch and pastoral expectations. What if I'm wrong? I asked. What if this desire for independence is selfish? What if I'm supposed to be content with supporting his ministry? Louise smiled, the expression carrying decades of hard-won wisdom. Honey, if God wanted you to be a supporting character in someone else's story, He wouldn't have given you your own gifts, your own passions, your own calling. The desire to use what He's given you isn't selfish, it's stewardship. That evening, I returned home to our empty house and spent hours in my grandmother's old rocking chair, thinking about calling, purpose, and the difference between serving God and serving someone else's interpretation of God's will. The bracelet felt warm against my wrist, a tangible reminder that there were people who believed in my capacity to make my own faithful choices. When my phone buzzed with another text from Marcus about networking opportunities at the conference, I found myself feeling distant from his excitement, rather than caught up in it. His success was genuine and his work had value, but it was his work, his calling, his kingdom to build. I was beginning to understand that supporting his dreams didn't have to mean abandoning my own. That night, I opened my laptop and began researching what it would take to relocate to Austin, what kind of housing I could afford on a nonprofit salary, how to rebuild a life from scratch at 32. The practical challenges were significant, but they felt surmountable in a way that continuing to disappear into Mrs. Marcus Webb did not. For the first time in years, I fell asleep excited about the possibility of tomorrow being different from today, of writing a story where Rachel Harper was the protagonist rather than the supporting cast. The bracelet caught the moonlight streaming through our bedroom window, its engraved promise a reminder that some plans were bigger than the ones we made for ourselves, and some futures required the courage to step away from security and into the unknown. The next morning brought an email from Sarah Chen with an official job offer, including salary details, benefits information, and a proposed start date 6 weeks away. The compensation was less than what Marcus made in monthly speaking fees, but it represented something more valuable than money. It represented the chance to be valued for my own contributions rather than my relationship to someone else's success. I printed the offer letter and sat at our kitchen table, reading through the terms and conditions while drinking coffee from a mug that read "Pastor's Wife" in flowing script. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was considering abandoning the role while literally drinking from a cup that defined me by it. Marcus would be home in a few hours, full of energy and new ideas for expanding New Hope's reach and influence. I could continue the conversation we'd started before he left, trying to express my need for autonomy and individual purpose within the framework of our current life. Or I could take the radical step of choosing my own path, regardless of how it aligned with his vision for our shared future. The bracelet caught the morning light as I reached for my phone to call Sarah Chen. Some decisions couldn't be made gradually or diplomatically. Some choices required the courage to leap before you could talk yourself out of the jump. "Sarah? This is Rachel Harper. I'd like to accept your offer." The words felt like the first honest thing I'd said in years. The first choice I'd made based purely on my own sense of calling and purpose. As I spoke the details of my acceptance, I felt something I'd almost forgotten, the exhilaration of authoring my own story rather than editing someone else's. Whatever came next would be mine to navigate, mine to celebrate, mine to regret if necessary. But it would be mine, and after 6 years of existing primarily as an extension of someone else's dreams, that felt like everything. Marcus returned from Nashville that Thursday evening, with the energy of someone who'd glimpsed a larger stage for his ambitions. He burst through our front door carrying a leather portfolio and wearing the satisfied expression of a man whose networking had exceeded expectations. The house filled with his enthusiasm as he detailed conversations with megachurch pastors, book publishers, and conference organizers who'd taken interest in his ministry approach. "You should have seen the response when I shared our growth model," he said, pacing around our living room while I prepared dinner according to his post-travel preferences. 3 different churches want to implement our small group structure, and there's serious interest in having me consult on their expansion strategies. I listened from the kitchen, noting how naturally he spoke of ownership over strategies and methods that had evolved through the contributions of dozens of staff members and volunteers over the years. In Marcus's narrative, he was the visionary architect while everyone else provided implementation support. "Dr. Peterson introduced me to his literary agent," Marcus continued, his voice rising with excitement. "She thinks my leadership philosophy could be the foundation for a best-selling book about church growth in post-Christian America." The chicken I was seasoning suddenly required intense concentration as I processed the implications of what he was describing. A book deal would mean speaking tours, media appearances, consulting opportunities that would cement his reputation as a thought leader in evangelical circles. It would also mean even less of his attention focused on our actual relationship and more energy devoted to building the Marcus Webb brand. "That's quite an opportunity," I said carefully, not trusting myself to sound appropriately enthusiastic about plans that would expand his platform while further marginalizing my own existence. Marcus appeared in the kitchen doorway, his smile faltering slightly as he studied my expression. "You don't seem very excited about this." "I'm processing it," I replied honestly. "It's a lot to take in." He moved closer, reaching for my hands in a gesture that had once felt comforting, but now seemed calculated to regain my attention and approval. Rachel, this could change everything for us. National influence, financial security, the ability to impact thousands of churches across the country. Isn't this what we've been working toward? The question hung between us, loaded with assumptions about shared goals and unified vision. When had we discussed working toward national influence? When had I agreed that my life's purpose was advancing his platform? The "we" in his statement felt like linguistic sleight of hand, creating the illusion of partnership in decisions I'd never been asked to make. What about what I want? The words escaped before I could consider their impact. Marcus's expression shifted from enthusiasm to confusion, as if I'd suddenly started speaking a foreign language. What do you mean? I mean that all of this expansion, this platform building, this national influence, when did we discuss whether that's what I wanted for our life? He released my hands and stepped back, his voice taking on the patient tone he used with counselees who were struggling to accept difficult truths. Rachel, honey, this is God's calling on our life together. When you married me, you joined your calling to mine. This opportunity isn't about what we want personally. It's about being faithful to the ministry God has entrusted to us. There it was again, the theological framework that made any personal desire suspect and any resistance to his vision equivalent to opposing God's will. But for the first time, instead of feeling guilty for wanting autonomy, I felt angry at how systematically he'd used Scripture to justify erasing my individual calling. What if God's calling on my life is different from yours? I asked. The question seemed to genuinely confuse him. We're married, Rachel. We're one flesh. Your calling is to support mine, to be my helpmate in building God's kingdom. According to you. According to the Bible. His voice was rising now, taking on the authority he wielded from the pulpit. I don't understand where this spirit of rebellion is coming from, but it needs to stop. We have an incredible opportunity in front of us, and I need my wife to be supportive, not creating problems. Spirit of rebellion. The phrase hit like a slap, reducing my desire for individual purpose to spiritual immaturity, and my questions about our dynamic to sinful resistance against divine order. It was the same language he'd used with other women in the church, who dared to want something beyond supporting their husband's ambitions. Maybe the problem isn't my spirit of rebellion, I said quietly. Maybe the problem is that you've never once asked what I want, or considered that God might have plans for my life that don't revolve around your career advancement. Marcus stared at me as if I'd just announced I was planning to join a cult. Your career advancement? Rachel, you're a pastor's wife. Your identity, your purpose, your significance come from supporting the ministry God has called me to lead. The words hit like physical blows, each one stripping away another layer of my individual worth, until nothing remained but my function in his success story. According to Marcus, I had no identity beyond my relationship to him, no purpose beyond advancing his goals, no significance beyond how well I performed the role he'd assigned me. I accepted a job offer today, I said, the words falling into the kitchen like grenades. The color drained from Marcus's face. You what? I interviewed for a literacy program coordinator position in Austin. They offered me the job, and I accepted it. For several heartbeats, Marcus just stared at me, his mind clearly struggling to process information that didn't fit into any category he'd prepared for. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely controlled. You interviewed for a job without telling me? I made a decision about my own career without asking your permission, yes? Permission? He laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Rachel, we're married. We make major life decisions together. You can't just unilaterally decide to take a job in another city without discussing it with your husband. The way you unilaterally decided to use my baptism as sermon material? The way you made plans for book deals and speaking tours without asking how I felt about becoming a public figure. The way you've structured our entire life around your vision, without once considering what I might want. Marcus ran his hands through his hair, his carefully maintained composure finally beginning to crack. This is insane. You're talking about destroying everything we've built together, abandoning the ministry God has blessed, walking away from our calling for some job with a nonprofit that probably pays nothing. I'm talking about reclaiming my own life, I said. about remembering that I'm a person with gifts and calling that exist independently of my relationship to you. Your gifts are being used. Marcus's voice echoed off our kitchen walls. Every Sunday, hundreds of women look to you as an example of biblical womanhood. Your influence in the women's ministry has helped shape lives, strengthen marriages, guide young women toward godly choices. How is that not using your gifts? Because it's not my ministry, I said simply, it's yours. I'm a prop in your version of biblical womanhood, a supporting character in your success story. Every story I tell, every testimony I share, every piece of advice I give, it all serves the narrative you've created about what a pastor's wife should be. Marcus leaned against the counter, his face flushed with anger and something that looked like desperation. So you're going to throw it all away? 6 years of marriage, a thriving ministry, a community that depends on us, financial security, all of it, for some fantasy about finding yourself? I'm going to choose my own path instead of walking in your shadow. There is no path outside of God's will, Rachel. And God's will for married women is submission to their husband's leadership. When you reject my authority, you're rejecting his authority. The theological trump card was delivered with the finality of a judge's gavel, designed to end the conversation by making any further resistance equivalent to rebelling against God himself. But instead of feeling guilty or intimidated, I felt a clarity I hadn't experienced in years. Maybe God's will for my life is bigger than your interpretation of Scripture, I said. Maybe he gave me gifts and passions and calling that aren't meant to be filtered through someone else's vision. Marcus straightened, his expression hardening into something I'd never seen directed at me before, the cold authority he used with church members who'd stepped out of line. I think you need to spend some serious time in prayer and biblical study. This rebellious attitude isn't coming from God. Everything that doesn't serve your purposes gets labeled as rebellion, doesn't it? My desire for meaningful work is rebellion. My need for individual identity is rebellion. My belief that God speaks to me directly instead of only through you is rebellion. Because it is rebellion, Marcus's voice boomed through the house. God established order in marriage, in the church, in society. When women reject male headship, they're rejecting his design for creation. I stared at this man I'd married, seeing clearly for the first time how thoroughly he'd constructed a theological system that made him infallible, and me perpetually wrong. Any question of his authority was automatically spiritual immaturity. Any desire for autonomy was rebellion against divine order. It was a closed loop that ensured his supremacy while erasing my agency. I start the new job in 6 weeks, I said quietly. I'll be moving to Austin whether you come with me or not. The ultimatum hung in the air between us, changing everything about our relationship's power dynamic. For 6 years, Marcus had been the one making pronouncements about our future while I'd provided support and agreement. Now I was making a unilateral decision about my own life, forcing him to respond rather than lead. You're not serious, he said, but his voice carried doubt rather than certainty. I've never been more serious about anything in my life. Marcus turned and walked out of the kitchen, his footsteps heavy on the stairs leading to his study. Within minutes I could hear him on the phone, his voice muffled but urgent. He was calling someone for advice, support, or validation. Probably Dr. Patterson, or one of the other pastors from the conference, who would confirm that I was experiencing a spiritual crisis that required strong male leadership to correct. I finished preparing dinner in the strange quiet that follows an earthquake, when the shaking has stopped, but the damage assessment is just beginning. Everything in our kitchen looked the same, but the foundation of our marriage had cracked open, revealing structural problems that had been hidden beneath years of careful maintenance and theological justification. The next morning, Marcus left early for the church without his usual goodbye kiss or discussion of the day's schedule. I found a note on the kitchen counter written in his careful handwriting. I've scheduled us for marriage counseling with Dr. Patterson this Friday at 2 p.m. We need godly counsel to work through this crisis, not, would you like to try counseling, or I think we could benefit from talking to someone together. Just a unilateral decision presented as fait accompli, the same pattern that had characterized our entire relationship. Marcus would decide what was best for us, and I would comply with his wisdom. But this time, I wouldn't be complying. I called Dr. Patterson's office and spoke with his secretary, explaining that I wouldn't be attending the scheduled session, but that Marcus was welcome to meet with the counselor individually if he found it helpful. The secretary's voice carried surprise and disapproval. Apparently, wives didn't typically decline pastoral counseling sessions their husbands had arranged. Instead of going to church that Sunday, I drove to Pine Creek Baptist, the small country church, where I'd been baptized at 12. The building was exactly as I remembered it, modest, weathered, authentic in a way that New Hope's gleaming facilities could never replicate. Pastor Williams had retired years ago, replaced by a young seminary graduate who preached with more enthusiasm than polish. Sitting in a pew near the back, I listened to a simple sermon about the woman at the well, about how Jesus had seen her as a person worthy of theological conversation, rather than dismissing her because of her gender or her past. The contrast with Marcus's authoritarian approach to spiritual leadership was striking. This young pastor spoke of partnership with God rather than submission to human hierarchy, of individual calling rather than predetermined roles based on gender. After the service, I introduced myself to Pastor Tommy and his wife Sarah, a couple barely out of seminary who were navigating the challenges of rural ministry with more humility than authority. When I mentioned my connection to the church through childhood baptism, their faces lit up with genuine warmth. Pastor Williams always spoke fondly of the Harper family, Pastor Tommy said. He used to tell stories about your grandmother's fierce faith and your commitment to learning scripture. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, covering theology, ministry philosophy, and the challenges of serving small communities with limited resources. What struck me most was how naturally they included me in discussions about biblical interpretation and pastoral care, never suggesting that my gender disqualified me from having valuable insights about spiritual matters. You know, Sarah said as we prepared to part ways, we've been looking for someone to help develop our adult education program. Your background in curriculum development would be perfect for what we're trying to accomplish. The offer was casual, mentioned almost in passing, but it represented something revolutionary, the possibility of using my gifts directly in ministry rather than as support for someone else's platform. At New Hope, my educational background was relevant only as it enhanced Marcus's credibility as a leader married to an intelligent woman. Here, it was seen as a qualification for actual ministry responsibility. Driving home, I thought about the difference between the two church environments I'd experienced that morning. New Hope was impressive, efficient, professionally managed, and focused on growth and influence. Pine Creek was humble, relational, community-focused, and more concerned with authentic faith than impressive metrics. Both approaches had value, but only one made space for me to be more than a supporting character. That afternoon, I called Chloe and asked if she wanted to go for a walk at the state park outside town. We'd hiked these trails together during college, solving the world's problems while working up a sweat on challenging terrain. Being there again felt like reconnecting with a part of myself I'd lost in the transition to pastoral respectability. You look different, Chloe said as we found our rhythm on the familiar path. Lighter somehow. I accepted a job in Austin, I told her. I'm leaving Marcus. Chloe stopped walking and turned to face me, her expressions cycling through surprise, concern, and something that looked like relief. Are you okay? What happened? I told her about the job offer, about Marcus's response, about the theological framework he'd used to dismiss my individual calling and reduce my worth to my function in his success. Chloe listened without interrupting, her face growing more troubled as I described the systematic way my identity had been erased over 6 years of marriage. I always wondered about that, she said when I finished. The way you started speaking differently after you married him. How you stopped expressing opinions that might conflict with his positions. I thought maybe you were just trying to be supportive, but it felt like you were disappearing. I was disappearing, I admitted. Piece by piece, choice by choice, until I couldn't remember what I wanted beyond what he told me I should want. We walked in comfortable silence for several minutes, the familiar rhythm of friendship requiring no words to process what had been shared. Being with Chloe reminded me of who I'd been before I'd learned to edit myself for pastoral acceptability, when my thoughts and opinions had value beyond how well they supported someone else's agenda. What will you do about housing? Chloe asked practically. Do you have money saved? The question forced me to confront the financial reality of my decision. Our joint accounts contained substantial savings, but most of our assets were tied to Marcus's ministry income and the church's support. Walking away from the marriage meant walking away from financial security, starting over with whatever I could claim as individually mine. "I'll figure it out," I said, surprised by my own confidence. "The job pays enough to cover basic expenses, and I'd rather struggle financially than continue disappearing emotionally." "You can stay with me while you get established," Chloe offered. "My guest room isn't fancy, but it's yours if you need it." The kindness in her voice brought tears to my eyes. For months, I'd felt isolated by the expectations of pastoral marriage, surrounded by people who saw me primarily as Marcus's wife, rather than as an individual worthy of friendship and support. Chloe's offer reminded me that there were people who valued Rachel Harper independently of her relationship to Pastor Webb. That evening, I returned home to find Marcus waiting in the living room with several other pastors from New Hope's leadership team. Elder Patricia Stone sat primly on our sofa, her expression radiating disapproval and concern. Dr. Patterson occupied the wingback chair, his notebook open and ready for what was clearly planned as an intervention rather than a conversation. "Rachel," Marcus said as I entered, his voice carrying false warmth over underlying steel. "I've asked some godly counselors to join us for a conversation about your recent struggles." The setup was clearly designed to overwhelm me with male authority and female peer pressure, to make me feel outnumbered and spiritually immature for questioning the established order. 3 against 1, with Marcus positioned as the concerned husband seeking help for his troubled wife, rather than a man whose authority was being challenged. "I don't recall agreeing to this meeting," I said, remaining standing near the doorway to maintain the option of leaving. "Sometimes when we're in spiritual crisis, we don't recognize our need for help," Dr. Patterson said, his tone carrying the condescending concern he used with women experiencing what he labeled as feminist rebellion. "Brother Marcus is concerned about some decisions you've made without proper counsel." Elder Stone nodded gravely. "Rachel, dear, we understand you're going through a difficult time. Many women struggle with contentment in their God-given roles. But running away to pursue worldly ambitions isn't the answer." The phrase God-given roles was loaded with assumptions about divine intention and gender hierarchy that I'd accepted without question for too many years. But sitting in that circle of people who saw my desire for individual purpose as spiritual failure, I felt clarity rather than shame. "My role is whatever God calls me to," I said simply. "Not whatever you've decided is appropriate for my gender." Dr. Patterson's eyebrows rose at what he clearly considered theological error. "Sister Rachel, Scripture is clear about the roles God has established for men and women. When we step outside those boundaries, we invite confusion and disorder into our lives." "Whose interpretation of Scripture?" I asked. "Yours? Marcus's? Or the same Holy Spirit who speaks to women as clearly as he speaks to men?" The room fell silent at what they considered borderline heresy. In their theological framework, women could receive guidance from God, but only as filtered through male interpretation and authority. Direct spiritual communication that contradicted male leadership was automatically suspect. Marcus leaned forward, his voice taking on the commanding tone he used from the pulpit. "Rachel, you're embarrassing yourself. These are godly people who care about our marriage and our ministry. Don't let pride prevent you from receiving their wisdom." "I'm not interested in wisdom that starts with the assumption that my calling is less important than yours," I replied. "I'm not interested in counsel that treats my desire for meaningful work as spiritual rebellion." I turned and walked toward the staircase, my heart pounding but my resolve firm. Behind me, I could hear urgent whispers as they processed my refusal to submit to their collective authority. For 6 years, I'd been trained to defer to male leadership and seek approval from other pastors' wives. Tonight, I'd walked away from both, choosing my own spiritual discernment over their communal pressure. In our bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed and called Sarah Chen to confirm details about my relocation timeline and job responsibilities. Her voice was warm and professional, discussing practical matters like housing assistance and orientation schedules. No one questioned my right to make career decisions or suggested that my choices required approval from male authorities. When Marcus finally came upstairs hours later, his face was flushed with anger and something that looked like genuine bewilderment. He'd never encountered a version of me that wouldn't eventually yield to pressure, that couldn't be convinced to prioritize his needs over my own wants. "They think you're having a nervous breakdown," he said without preamble. "Dr. Patterson believes you need intensive counseling, possibly medication for depression. Because I want meaningful work instead of being your supporting cast. Because you're destroying everything we've built together for some fantasy about finding yourself." Marcus sat heavily in the chair across from our bed, looking defeated rather than authoritative. "Do you have any idea what this is doing to my reputation? To the church? People are already asking questions about my ability to lead if I can't even manage my own household." There it was, the core concern beneath all the theological arguments and spiritual language. My independence reflected poorly on his leadership brand. My refusal to submit undermined his authority in ways that could damage his career prospects and platform building. "Maybe your household doesn't need managing," I said. "Maybe it needs partnership." "Partnership requires unity," Marcus replied. "It requires both people working toward the same goals, sharing the same vision for their life together. It requires both people having a voice in determining what those goals and visions are," I countered. "When did we ever discuss whether I wanted to be a public figure? When did you ask if I was comfortable with our life being used as an example for other couples? When did my dreams matter as much as yours?" Marcus stared at me as if seeing a stranger, someone who'd somehow invaded his carefully ordered world and disrupted all his assumptions about how marriage and ministry were supposed to function. For 6 years, I'd been predictable, manageable, supportive. Now I was autonomous, unpredictable, potentially dangerous to everything he'd worked to build. "I don't know who you've become," he said finally, "but this isn't the woman I married." "You're right," I replied. "The woman you married was willing to disappear for your convenience. This woman isn't." That night, we slept in the same bed but in different worlds, both processing the end of a marriage that had been more about role fulfillment than genuine partnership. Marcus still believed he could fix this crisis through the right combination of pressure, counseling, and theological argument. I knew that no amount of intervention could repair what had been broken from the beginning, the fundamental assumption that my life existed primarily to enhance his. In the morning, I would begin the practical work of extracting myself from 6 years of financial and social entanglement. But tonight, for the first time in years, I fell asleep excited about a future that belonged entirely to me, whatever its challenges might bring. The weeks that followed moved with the strange momentum of inevitability, each day bringing me closer to a future I was creating rather than one being imposed upon me. Marcus alternated between ignoring my existence and attempting grand gestures designed to demonstrate what I would be losing by walking away from our life together. Neither approach swayed me from the path I'd chosen. On a Tuesday morning, I received a call from Janet Morrison, one of New Hope's founding members, and the unofficial keeper of church gossip. Her voice carried the carefully modulated concern that church ladies used when delivering devastating news under the guise of spiritual support. "Rachel, dear, I felt led to reach out to you," she began, her tone dripping with false sweetness. "There are some concerning rumors circulating about your marriage, and I wanted to give you the opportunity to address them before they spread further." I set down my coffee and prepared for whatever version of truth had been carefully crafted to serve the church's narrative. "What rumors are those, Janet?" "Well, people are saying you're planning to leave Pastor Marcus for some job opportunity." Of course, I told them that couldn't possibly be true, that a godly wife would never abandon her husband's ministry for worldly pursuits. The conversation continued for 20 minutes. Janet fishing for information while simultaneously delivering warnings about the consequences of my choices. According to her, several church families were already expressing concerns about Marcus's leadership abilities if he couldn't maintain order in his own household. The implication was clear. My independence was damaging his reputation and threatening the stability of the entire congregation. "I just think you should know," Janet concluded, "that your decisions affect more people than just yourself. This church depends on strong pastoral leadership, and anything that undermines that leadership hurts the entire body of Christ." After she hung up, I sat in my kitchen processing the sophisticated emotional manipulation that had just occurred. Janet had managed to make me responsible for the spiritual well-being of 3,000 church members, suggesting that my personal choices about career and calling were selfish acts that would damage innocent people's faith. It was a masterful application of guilt and social pressure designed to push me back into compliance. But instead of feeling guilty, I felt angry. These were the same tactics Marcus had used for years, making me responsible for outcomes beyond my control, while denying me agency in decisions that affected my own life. The entire system was designed to maintain the status quo by making change seem spiritually dangerous and personally destructive. That afternoon, I drove to Austin for a house hunting trip that Sarah Chen had helped arrange through the nonprofit's relocation services. The 3-hour drive gave me time to think about the conversation with Janet and the broader pattern of manipulation I'd been subjected to over the years. How many women had been convinced to abandon their dreams through similar applications of theological pressure and community guilt? Austin felt like stepping into a different universe. The city buzzed with creative energy and diverse perspectives, a sharp contrast to the conservative homogeneity of Riverside. People here seemed to value authenticity over conformity, innovation over tradition. Walking through neighborhoods where I might soon live, I felt excited about the possibility of discovering who Rachel Harper could become when freed from the constraints of pastoral expectations. The apartment Sarah showed me was modest, but charming, with large windows that filled the space with natural light and built-in bookshelves that spoke to priorities I shared. The rent was manageable on my nonprofit salary, and the location provided easy access to both the literacy program's offices and the diverse communities we served. The previous tenant was a teacher who left to join the Peace Corps, Sarah explained, as we toured the small but functional kitchen. She said the space inspired her to think creatively about education and community development. Standing in that apartment, I could envision myself reading curriculum proposals at the kitchen table, hosting strategy meetings with fellow staff members, building a life centered around meaningful work rather than supporting someone else's platform. The vision felt both terrifying and exhilarating, the prospect of starting over completely, with no safety net beyond my own capabilities and determination. The drive back to Riverside brought me through small towns that had remained largely unchanged for decades, their main streets lined with struggling businesses and abandoned storefronts. These communities represented the world I was leaving behind, places where tradition and hierarchy provided stability at the cost of innovation and individual expression. There was beauty in their consistency, but also a suffocating quality that I was finally ready to escape. Marcus was waiting when I returned home, sitting in his study with legal documents spread across his desk. He looked up as I entered, his expression unreadable, but his posture radiating controlled tension. "I've been consulting with our attorney about the financial implications of your decision," he said without preamble. "There are some things we need to discuss." I sat down across from him, noting how he'd positioned himself behind his desk in a power position designed to emphasize his authority and my subordinate status. Even in conversations about dissolving our marriage, he couldn't resist asserting dominance through physical positioning and formal language. "What kind of things?" I asked. "The house, for starters. It's jointly owned, so we'll need to decide whether to sell it or if one of us wants to buy out the other's equity." Marcus shuffled through papers with practiced efficiency. "Then there are the retirement accounts, the investment portfolio, the joint savings. Everything will need to be divided according to Tennessee law." He delivered the information in the dispassionate tone he used for church business meetings, reducing the dissolution of our marriage to a series of financial transactions and legal procedures. There was no discussion of counseling, no attempt to address the underlying issues that had led to this point, no acknowledgement that we were ending a relationship rather than simply liquidating assets. "I don't want anything beyond what I brought into the marriage," I said, surprising myself with the decisiveness in my voice. "Keep the house, keep the investments, keep everything we accumulated during our time together." Marcus looked up from his papers, genuine confusion replacing his carefully controlled expression. "Rachel, you're entitled to half of everything. The attorney says you could claim significant support payments given the disparity in our earning potential." "I don't want support payments. I don't want half of your success. I just want my freedom." The concept seemed to genuinely puzzle him. In Marcus's worldview, money and security were the primary motivators for most decisions. The idea that I would walk away from financial benefit for the intangible value of autonomy didn't fit into any category he understood. "You're being foolish," he said finally. "This nonprofit job will barely cover your living expenses. You're giving up financial security for some idealistic notion about finding fulfillment through work." "I'm trading money for integrity," I replied. "Trading security for authenticity. Trading comfort for the chance to use my gifts directly instead of as support for someone else's platform." Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying me with the analytical expression he used when trying to understand particularly challenging theological concepts. "I honestly don't know who you've become. The woman I married understood the value of stability, appreciated the good life we'd built together, took pride in being part of something bigger than herself. The woman you married was taught to measure her worth by how well she supported your dreams," I said. "I've finally learned to measure my worth by how faithful I am to my own calling." The conversation continued for another hour, covering practical details about separating our lives and dividing our possessions. Marcus approached each topic with the efficiency of someone closing a business deal, while I found myself feeling increasingly liberated with each decision to walk away from the accumulated symbols of our shared success. When we finished, Marcus gathered his papers with decisive movements that suggested he'd already moved on mentally to the challenges of rebuilding his ministry reputation and platform. "I'll have the paperwork drawn up according to what we discussed. You can review it with your own attorney if you want." "I trust your honesty about the financial details," I said, standing to leave his study. "Rachel," his voice stopped me at the doorway. "I hope someday you'll realize what you're throwing away. What we had together, what we built, the impact we made. Most people never get the chance to be part of something so significant." "What you built," I corrected gently. "What you achieved. I was just the supporting actress in your success story." That evening, I called my mother for the first time since the baptism dress incident. She answered on the second ring, her voice carrying a mixture of wariness and hope. "I owe you an apology," I said without preamble. "You were right about Marcus, about our marriage, about what I'd given up to be his wife." The silence on the other end stretched for several heartbeats before my mother spoke, her voice thick with emotion. "Oh, sweetheart, I'm so sorry about how I handled things. Wearing your dress was cruel, even if I was trying to wake you up to what was happening." "It worked," I said. "Maybe not the way you intended, but it started me thinking about who I used to be before I became Mrs. Marcus Webb." We talked for 2 hours, my mother sharing observations she'd kept to herself for years about watching me disappear into the role of pastor's wife. She described seeing my opinions become more cautious, my dreams smaller, my entire identity shrinking to fit the expectations of evangelical femininity. "I raised you to be a leader," she said, echoing words Aunt Louise had shared. "I taught you to think critically, to question authority, to never let anyone speak for you. Watching you lose those qualities was heartbreaking." "I haven't lost them," I replied. "I just forgot I had them for a while." The next Sunday was my last at New Hope Megachurch. I debated whether to attend at all, but something in me needed closure with the community that had been my world for 6 years. Marcus and I had agreed to present a unified front about our separation, describing it as a mutual decision to pursue different callings, rather than airing the theological and personal conflicts that had led to this point. The sanctuary was filled to capacity as usual. 3,000 people gathered for what many of them assumed would be Marcus's triumphant return from the Nashville conference, with news about expanding opportunities and national recognition. I took my usual seat in the front row, but for the first time in years I felt like an observer rather than a participant in the carefully orchestrated worship experience. Marcus delivered his sermon with characteristic polish, speaking about the courage required to follow God's calling even when it led to unexpected places. He wove in subtle references to seasons of change and the importance of supporting each other through transitions, preparing the congregation for the announcement that would come at the end of the service. "Sometimes," he said, his voice carrying across the sanctuary with practiced authority, "God calls us to step out of our comfort zones, to pursue opportunities that might seem risky or unconventional. When that happens, we have to trust that His plans are bigger than our understanding. I listened to Him co-opt the language of calling and divine guidance, to frame our separation in terms that would protect His reputation, while making my departure seem like a spiritual journey, rather than an escape from His control. Even in ending our marriage, He was managing the narrative to serve His purposes. After the service, Marcus announced our decision to the congregation with carefully chosen words about mutual respect, different seasons of calling, and continued support for each other's ministries. The reaction was a mixture of shock, confusion, and carefully controlled concern. Several people approached me with questions and expressions of support, though I could see the calculation in their eyes as they tried to determine which version of events would eventually prove accurate. Elder Patricia Stone was among the first to reach me, her expression radiating disapproval disguised as pastoral concern. "Rachel, dear, I hope you'll reconsider this decision. Marriage is a sacred covenant that shouldn't be abandoned lightly." "I'm not abandoning anything lightly," I replied. "I'm choosing to honor the calling God has placed on my life, even when it doesn't align with other people's expectations." "But your calling is to be Marcus's helpmate," she insisted. "When you step outside that role, you're stepping outside God's design for your life." The conversation was interrupted by Chloe, who'd come to the service specifically to support me through this difficult transition. She positioned herself beside me with the protective stance of someone ready to defend a friend against further manipulation. "It's time to go," she said simply, and I was grateful for the intervention. As we walked toward the parking lot, I could feel hundreds of eyes following our movement, congregation members already forming opinions about what my departure meant for the church's stability and Marcus's leadership credibility. Some would support him completely, accepting his version of events without question. Others would ask uncomfortable questions about how a pastor's marriage could fail if his understanding of biblical relationships was truly sound. That afternoon, I began the physical process of separating my possessions from our shared life. 6 years of marriage had created deep entanglements between our belongings, but I found myself caring less about material objects than I'd expected. The books I'd collected before marriage, the photo albums from my childhood, my grandmother's jewelry, a few pieces of furniture that held sentimental value. These were the only things I wanted to take with me to Austin. Marcus watched from his study doorway as I packed boxes, his expression cycling between sadness and resentment. Occasionally, he would offer commentary about items I was leaving behind, as if trying to remind me of what I was giving up. "You're really going to leave your piano?" he asked as I walked past the baby grand that had been a wedding gift from his parents. "You used to play it every day." "I stopped playing when you decided my music was too distracting during your sermon preparation time," I replied. I'd forgotten how much I loved it until I realized I wasn't allowed to express that love anymore. The comment hung in the air between us, another example of how my individual interests had been gradually subordinated to his professional needs. The piano represented a pattern that extended far beyond music. My hobbies, friendships, career aspirations, and personal dreams had all been evaluated through the lens of how they affected his ministry platform. "You could have talked to me about that," Marcus said. "I didn't know you felt restricted." "I tried to talk to you about a lot of things. Every conversation ended with you explaining why my desires were less important than your calling, why my needs should be secondary to the church's requirements, why my individual growth might threaten our unity." Marcus was quiet for a long time, perhaps recognizing the truth in my observations, even if he wasn't ready to accept responsibility for the systematic way he'd diminished my autonomy. "I thought we were building something together." "You were building something. I was providing support for your vision. There's a difference." 2 weeks later, I drove away from Riverside with everything I owned packed into a small moving truck and my car. The town looked different in my rearview mirror, smaller, more constrained, less significant than it had seemed when my entire world revolved around New Hope Megachurch and pastoral expectations. I felt a mixture of sadness for what I was leaving behind and excitement for what lay ahead. Austin welcomed me with the energy of a city that celebrated reinvention and individual expression. My new apartment felt like a sanctuary where I could rediscover interests and perspectives that had been dormant for years. The literacy program work proved challenging and fulfilling in ways I'd forgotten were possible. connecting me with communities that valued education and empowerment over conformity and submission. My colleagues at the nonprofit treated me as a professional peer rather than a pastoral appendage. They asked for my opinions on curriculum development, included me in strategic planning discussions, and valued my contributions based on their merit rather than my relationship to someone in authority. The experience of being seen and heard as an individual rather than a supporting character was both exhilarating and healing. 6 months after leaving Riverside, I received an unexpected phone call from Pastor Tommy at Pine Creek Baptist Church. He and Sarah had been following my transition through mutual connections and wanted to discuss a part-time opportunity that might interest me. "We're developing a community outreach program focused on adult literacy and job training," Tommy explained. "Sarah mentioned your background and your passion for educational equity. We wondered if you might consider consulting with us on curriculum development and program design." The offer represented something I'd never thought possible: the chance to use my gifts directly in ministry without being filtered through someone else's authority or vision. At Pine Creek, my educational background and passion for community development were seen as qualifications for leadership rather than assets to be managed by male oversight. I accepted the consulting role and found myself working with a church community that valued partnership over hierarchy, collaboration over control. The contrast with my experience at New Hope was stark and liberating. Here, women were encouraged to use their gifts fully, theological discussions included diverse perspectives, and individual calling was seen as something to be discerned personally rather than assigned based on gender roles. The literacy program we developed became a model for other rural churches, combining practical skills training with community building and spiritual formation. Working parents could improve their reading and math skills, while their children participated in educational activities designed to break cycles of academic disadvantage. The program served real needs in tangible ways, creating measurable impact rather than impressive statistics. A year after leaving Marcus, I was asked to speak at a conference about faith-based community development. Standing on that stage, sharing insights about education and empowerment with an audience of nonprofit leaders and progressive pastors, I felt the profound satisfaction of using my voice to advance causes I cared about, rather than supporting someone else's platform. During the question and answer session, a young woman asked about balancing personal calling with family responsibilities. Her question reminded me of conversations I'd had with women at New Hope, who were struggling to reconcile their individual gifts with traditional expectations about wives and mothers. "I think," I said carefully, "that we do a disservice to families when we teach women that their highest calling is supporting other people's dreams rather than pursuing their own. Children benefit from seeing their mothers use their gifts fully. Husbands benefit from partnerships with women who are fulfilled and growing, rather than diminished and resentful." The response was enthusiastic, with many conference attendees approaching me afterward to share their own struggles with navigating calling and relationships. Several pastors' wives expressed gratitude for permission to want more from their lives than constant support for their husbands' ministries. That evening, I called Aunt Louise to share news about the conference and the ongoing development of the literacy program. At 88, she remained sharp and encouraging, celebrating my professional growth with the pride of someone who'd always believed in my potential. "Your grandmother would be so proud," she said, her voice warm with satisfaction. "She always knew you had leadership gifts that needed room to grow." "I'm finally learning to trust my own discernment," I replied, "to believe that God speaks to me directly, rather than only through other people's interpretation." "That's what real faith looks like," Louise said. "Not blind obedience to human authority, but the courage to follow divine calling wherever it leads." 2 years after my divorce from Marcus was finalized, I learned through mutual acquaintances that he'd remarried, a young seminary graduate who'd been hired as New Hope's worship coordinator. The new Mrs. Webb was reportedly everything I hadn't been: compliant, uncomplicated, content to support his vision without questioning or contributing competing ideas. I felt no jealousy at the news, only sympathy for a young woman who might someday face the same choice between self-erasure and authentic living that I'd confronted. Marcus needed a supporting character for his success story, and he'd found someone willing to play that role. Whether she would remain content in that position remained to be seen. My own life had evolved in directions I couldn't have imagined during my years as a pastor's wife. The literacy program had expanded to serve 6 rural communities, providing educational opportunities for hundreds of adults who'd never had access to quality learning resources. I'd been promoted to regional coordinator, overseeing program development across 3 states, and training other staff members in community-centered educational approaches. More importantly, I'd rebuilt my relationship with faith on terms that honored both divine calling and individual agency. My spiritual life was no longer mediated through someone else's interpretation or constrained by theological systems designed to maintain human hierarchies. I'd learned to distinguish between biblical principles and patriarchal traditions, between divine guidance and masculine control. The bracelet from my grandmother remained a constant reminder that God's plans for my life were bigger than other people's plans for my life, that calling was something to be discerned personally rather than assigned by gender or relationship status. I'd learned to trust the voice that had always been there, quietly encouraging me to use my gifts fully rather than partially, to lead rather than follow, to speak rather than remain silent. Standing in my Austin apartment on a Sunday morning, preparing for a day of hiking and reading rather than church obligations, I reflected on the journey that had brought me from the front pew of New Hope Megachurch to this place of authentic freedom. The cost had been significant: financial security, social status, community belonging, the comfort of defined roles and clear expectations. But the gain had been immeasurable. I'd reclaimed my voice, rediscovered my calling, rebuilt my relationship with God on terms that honored my full humanity rather than limiting it to approved feminine expressions. I'd learned that faithfulness sometimes required the courage to disappoint people who'd benefited from my compliance, to risk everything for the chance to become who I was created to be rather than who others needed me to be. The phone rang, interrupting my morning reflection. It was Sarah Chen with news about a grant opportunity that could fund expansion of our literacy program into urban communities facing different but equally challenging educational barriers. As we discussed strategies for curriculum adaptation and community partnership development, I felt the familiar excitement of meaningful work that aligned with my deepest values and utilized my strongest gifts. This was what calling looked like when it wasn't filtered through someone else's vision or constrained by artificial limitations. This was the life my grandmother had prepared me for, the future my mother had hoped I'd claim, the purpose God had been patiently waiting for me to pursue. After ending the call, I sat by my window watching Austin come alive with the energy of people pursuing their own dreams rather than supporting other people's ambitions. Somewhere in the distance, church bells were calling people to worship in communities that might value their voices or might require their silence. Either way, they would have to make their own choices about how much of themselves to offer and how much to preserve. I'd made my choice, and despite its challenges and uncertainties, I'd never been more grateful for the courage to step away from safety and into the adventure of becoming fully myself. The girl with fire in her eyes that my mother had mourned wasn't lost after all. She'd just been waiting for permission to burn brightly again. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.